Welcome to Module 2, everyone. We are going to read Chapters 3 and 5 in How Languages Are Learned, and we're also going to read Chapters 4 and 7 in Scaffolding Language, Scaffolding Learning. Those will be over oral language development, so that will include speaking and listening, which is why there are 2 chapters this week. As for your assignments, you will want your Module 2 note-taking packet out to follow along with the PowerPoint videos. There will be 4 this week, because there are 4 parts to this module, and you will want to complete your text response. You will also have your oral language strategy action plan video forum that's due, and you'll want to make 2 online replies. And then we'll also be doing an analysis of an English language learner, and you'll want to make sure that if you are going to do an interview with English language learner that you have that completed by this week, because you are going to be analyzing that and writing your paper next week. So it'd be a good idea to have that done. So again, you're going to want to download this. The text is going to be in red for Module 2, and we're going to look for that yellow star to indicate what we're going to be writing in our weekly text reflection. So for this one, we're going to look at Part 1, Learners' Individual Differences. This is found in the text in Chapter 3, and we're going to look at identifying and discussing how those differences in learners can impact their ability to learn a new language, and we're going to read a biography on a person learning a language and analyze what factors might positively or negatively impact their ability to achieve success, and that will be part of your Analyzing a Learner assignment. So when we look and talk about individual differences in language learners, we are looking at 7 main things: intelligence, their aptitude, their personal learning style and personality, their motivation and attitude to learn, the identity of the student and their ethnic group affiliation, and their age. So I want to make an important note here. In studying the correlation between these individual differences and someone's language learning ability, researchers admit that their tests may not be completely reliable because data is often collected through questionnaires that ask individuals to self-assess. So the strength of the information that they get from these studies are based on the students' ability to self-assess and be honest. So just wanted to have that be a little caveat before we get going. So let's look first at intelligence. What can a person's intelligence predict in regards to his or her ability to learn a new language? Think about that question for a minute. What can your intelligence actually predict in regard to your ability to learn a new language? IQ scores have been able to predict success in acquiring the ability to read, understand grammar, and a person's projected vocabulary in a new language, or essentially their academic abilities. Academic success in their L1 is the strongest predictor of your success in L2. IQ scores are unrelated to oral production skills, however, and here is a few researchers that you can explore more about in the chapter. So there are essentially 2 extremes. Students whose academic performance is usually very good might really struggle with learning a language, while on the other hand, there are polyglot savants whose overall cognitive functioning and social skills are very limited, but they're able to pick up languages in no time at all. So that's kind of in reference to those IQ studies that were listed above. So there are those 2 extremes. Just because you are gifted in academic performance, you may still struggle learning a language. And however, if you have very low cognitive functioning and social skills, that doesn't mean that you can't pick up language. There is a lot of research that shows that people are able to pick up languages in no time at all. So let's look at that aptitude. Your aptitude really is defined as your ability to learn quickly. So when we think about aptitude tests, they usually measure someone's ability to hear, identify, and memorize new sounds, to understand the function of particular words in a sentence, to figure out grammatical rules from language samples, and to remember new words. Essentially, that's what aptitude tests are looking at. So I want to note, talent in all these areas is not a requirement for success in L2 learning. So if you're looking at that and you're like, wow, I really have a hard time figuring out grammatical rules or remembering new words, or memorizing new sounds, especially when I'm hearing someone trying to teach me maybe something in a new language. That doesn't mean that that's a requirement for your success in learning a new language. That doesn't mean that you should already count yourself out and say, nope, can't learn Japanese. When I hear my friends speaking in Japanese, I can't figure out what they're talking about. I can't remember the new words. I can't pronounce them. That doesn't mean that you can't learn. For example, some achieve success because of their linguistic analytic abilities and others because of their memory aptitude. Some of you might have high linguistic analytic abilities. Others of you might just have a really good memory. So researchers have recently found that aptitude is a predictor of success in both the natural language learning context and in formal classroom instruction. And perhaps the method in which you're learning will have more of a predictor on how well you learn rather than your actual aptitude. So let's take a look at learning styles and cognitive styles. What do we mean by that? Well, I'm defining that really as learners' way of absorbing, processing, and retaining information. So learners are rarely thought to be one extreme or the other. Rather, they're located somewhere in between the ends. So when we talk about learning style or cognitive style, we're talking about either field dependent or field independent. So when we talk about being field dependent, we realize that students are usually holistic versus analytic, which you would find in field independent. When you are field dependent, you're focusing on the meaning. When you are field independent, you have that kind of cognitive learning style. Your focus is on the form. And when you're field dependent, you learn your new language best when it's highly contextualized. And if you're field independent, you learn best in a formal class setting. So let's look at this a different way. If you were a field independent person and you saw a hidden picture example, do you remember any of these from childhood? My daughter loves doing things like Where's Waldo? So you see a picture and you're trying to find all of these specific little details. The ball, the dog bed, the brush, the leash. If you are field independent, you're paying attention to these intricate details when you see a picture. You are looking and you're finding that dog food, the training book, the bowl. You're very highly engaged with the specifics, the intricate details. If you are field dependent, you see the whole picture, and sometimes it's hard to separate it into smaller parts. That's another way of looking at this learning style difference. The next thing that we look at is personality traits. What are the personality traits of the person learning a language? Actually, your personality has a lot to do with how well you acquire something. So the bold words indicate positive correlation with success in new language learning. So if you are self-confident, if you are a risk taker, if you are adventurous, imaginative, empathetic, and tolerant of ambiguity, you're probably going to have a better correlation with success, or there's a better correlation of success in L2 learning. Those things are very important. You have to be able to take risks and be adventurous. If you are shy and risk avoiding and anxious, that's going to be really difficult for you. If you're uninquisitive, if you don't really care, if you're insensitive to others or you're closure oriented, it's going to be really hard to acquire a second language. There are some where there isn't necessarily a strong positive or negative correlation. Introverts and extroverts both have the ability to learn a language. If you are reflective or impulsive or creative or uncreative, those aren't huge correlations. However, these 6 bold words are. So it's believed to impact conversational skills, but not necessarily your literacy or academic skills, which is easy to see if you think about conversation. You have to be confident. You have to be able to be adventurous and risk-taking and, empathetic and tolerant of ambiguity. You're going to want to step up and talk to people. If you are shy or anxious, you are probably not going to be someone that's going to try to improve those conversational skills. So therefore, those are perhaps not going to be as robust. However, we're not talking about the literacy and academic skills. There is no empirical evidence, however, and many researchers feel that personality has an important influence on language learning in general. Let's talk a little bit more about that anxiety, because a lot of ELL students, and I'm sure you could put yourself in that category when you are learning a new language, experience anxiety. It has received the most attention in second language acquisition research, along with lack of anxiety as an important component of self-confidence. So it correlates negatively with measures of L2 proficiency. So you can see the picture, the language stresses me out. The more students are anxious, the harder it is for them to really acquire that. This traces back to when we talked about Stephen Krashen and his research, and we talked about that affective filter. The more that you can have a student feel comfortable and safe, the more that you can reduce that barrier and reduce their anxiety and help them to take risks, the better they're going to do. Now let's talk a little bit about motivation and attitude. Just like anything in life, your motivation and your attitude towards it, especially when you're faced with challenges, is very important to your success or the outcome. It's that idea of grit and resiliency, that growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So they're frequently cited when explaining why some learners are more successful than others. And there's two types of motivation. There is integrative motivation and instrumental motivation. Let's look at the difference between those. The integrative is that emotional and the affective factors involved. So maybe, for instance, it's a romantic interest. You're in a foreign country, you meet someone, and you have a romantic interest in them. You are going to have a little bit more personal desire to learn about or associate with the people who use it. You're going to be highly motivated to learn that language so that you can talk with that person that you might have an interest in. Instrumental motivation, on the other hand, is the more practical side of things. Practical factors like business opportunities or to access scientific or technical information or passing a course. That's more of your instrumental motivation. So I'm going to liken this with a couple of images. So that integrative motivation is like the heart. You know, it might not always be romantic interest. I just use that as an example. But you have a passionate, a personal desire to learn something new. That instrumental is more of the business, scientific, passing a course, very practical side of things. So when we think about motivation in the classroom, I loved this quote from page 64. Teachers can make a positive contribution to students' motivation to learn if classrooms are places that students enjoy coming to because the content is interesting, relevant to their age and level of ability. The learning goals are challenging, yet manageable and clear, and the atmosphere is supportive. This ties into everything we talk about in education classes. This likens to what Krashen's talking about with challenging yet manageable, that it's that intellect plus one, that it's not super easy, it's challenging, but it's manageable and clear, and there is support. We all have talked about how much engagement plays into learning. It needs to be interesting. It needs to be relevant to them. That really can increase motivation in the classroom. One of the last ones we're going to talk about is identity and ethnic group affiliation. And this is really talking about social dynamics and power relationships. What do I mean by that? I mean asking, is the target language valued? What the student is learning, the target language. In most of our cases, that would be English, learning English as a second or new language learner. Is that valued? So here are some different examples from a variety of different students. Fuad and Faisal were learning the Somali language, or they were Somali language speakers, and were learning English. For them, their Somali language was very important to their community. And learning that target language for them they didn't have as much motivation to learn it. They really just wanted to be with their Somali peers and speak their Somali language. For Maria, she's learning Spanish in Anoka, Minnesota. She is learning that more for the practical side of things. It's a class she has to take. She's having a much different identity with that. She's also an English speaker that's learning Spanish. So again, that identity and who she is and her ethnic group affiliation is going to be a little different. I use this example of Native Americans from my experience teaching in Arizona. They would call English, and this is kind of used with permission because this is the wording that they would use. They would call Standard English and Res English. Res English would be a little different. It would be words that were very familiar with the reservation, words that they would use there. I'm not going to repeat some of them here, versus the Standard English they would hear in town or at school. And there was a different social dynamic and power relationship. If they were sounding too educated, they would not always be as widely accepted on the reservation. This reminds me of reading Michelle Obama's autobiography called Becoming, and she would talk about how she sounded too white for her cousins. She would visit them and they would ask her, "Why do you sound like a white person?" Her language was used differently, and that created a social dynamic and a power relationship. Her cousins, her family members, felt like she thought that she was better than them, that she was forming a different sort of identity, and she wasn't affiliating with her ethnic group. She wasn't using Ebonics or perhaps language that cousins and relatives were using. And so that was really looked at differently. The target language, meaning just the English that she was using from school, wasn't really valued with her family members. It was actually looked down upon. So again, this is what we're looking at. Your identity and your ethnic group affiliation, their feelings towards the target language and what you're using can really affect the student's motivation and ability to learn a new language. So essentially the question is, do you want to maintain affiliation with your L1 culture? Learners with native-like pronunciation were viewed as having less loyalty to their ethnic group as compared with those who retained a foreign accent. So keeping this in mind, that a lot of motivation, a lot of ability and success in learning a new language has to really deal with those social dynamics and power relationships, your identity, your ethnic group affiliation, because as you learn more language and maybe are moving away from your L1, depending on how your L1 culture, the people around you, view the language you are learning, really has a strong impact or correlation on how much you learn, on your views towards it, how much you retain, the accent you use, all of those types of things. The last one we're going to look at is age. And there are benefits of age differences in second language acquisition. There is benefits in being younger. There are benefits in being older. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, "Oh, you need to learn a new language when you're young. Don't wait until you're old. When you're old, you can't learn a new language anymore. It's too difficult. You don't have as strong of a memory." That's not necessarily true. There are benefits to both. So if we look at the younger advantage, you're not as analytical. You have fewer inhibitions. You're not quite as embarrassed. You are willing to take more risks. You might have weaker group identity because you're so young. Like I think of a kindergartner going into a Spanish immersion school. They probably have weaker group identity than someone that has greater knowledge of their L1. And simplified input is more likely. However, on the other side, when you're an older adult, there are some advantages to that. You have analytical ability. You have pragmatic skills. You have learned a new language. You can apply some of what you've learned to this new learning you're doing. You have that greater knowledge of your first language, and you have real world knowledge, like problem solving skills. So there really is a benefit to both. So I'm going to have you look at these general findings for age. There are 3 studies included in the text, and I want you to summarize the studies and findings in your packet. So the first one is Pakowski, and they asked, will there be a difference between learners who began to learn English before puberty and those who began learning English later? So you can kind of actually decide right now, what do you think the results or the findings are going to say? Is there a difference between those before puberty and after? And what will that difference be? Is it easier to learn before puberty or after puberty? Johnson and Newport asked, does the age at which speakers begin learning English impact their ability to judge the grammaticality of English sentences? What do you think? And then Snow and Hofnagel and Howe asked, how does a language learner's age impact their rate of learning over time? So I want you to take a little bit deeper look at these studies and see what you can summarize from the reading about those, and think deeply about what that might tell you about your own future teaching and learning. So that is the end of section 1. I'm going to include a little bit of information about that assignment. After you summarize those studies in your packet, you do have one more assignment this week that is a little different from previous weeks, and you're going to analyze a language learner. So it's going to be based all on what we've learned here in the first video. So each of you are assigned to read a language learner's biography that's included on the LMS. You'll read through it, and then I want you to decide how this person's individual characteristics might impact their ability to achieve success in learning a new language. So think about all those 7 areas we talked about. What's their intelligence? So you might have to dig a little deeper into the story and make some inferences. Have they been to school before? How much? What's their aptitude? Have they learned other languages before? What's their learning style? And again, you might have to infer that. What's their personality? Again, what can you infer by what you've been told in that biography? What's their motivation and attitude? So did they have an integrative or an instrumental? Are they passionate about learning it, or is it just something that they feel like they need to do to pass a class or to gain more knowledge? Again, with identity and ethnic group affiliation, you're going to have to infer based on what you know. What do you think the affiliation in their ethnic group and their identity, how is that going to be impacted? Is it going to be positive or negative? And then age. And based on the studies presented, what can you conclude about their age and learning the language now? So you'll write a 1-page double-spaced paper and upload this analysis on the LMS addressing those 7 areas.